Hello folks, and welcome to this little sort of a side video, if you will, from the Gaming from History series, looking at history's greatest generals according to my playthroughs of the Total War games. Somewhat unfortunate that you can't really take out individual sort of generals' performances from the Paradox games. It would be nice to sort of compare and contrast those, but in this series, we're just looking at my performance as a player with historical generals through the Total War series, and how historical generals are implemented and how they kind of perform in game varies greatly from game to game. So it's a very inexact science here. So just a little exploration to see, how these things shake out. So we've got, two lists here I just took from the internet to give us a little bit of an indicator of who the greatest generals in history might be based on our sort of like real world assessment. On the left, we've got Cottereau, that I believe did an analysis based purely on most battles won. And then on the right, We Are Mighty, or Ethan Arsh, that I've seen it referenced as a piece that takes that a wee bit further and looks at sort of quality of victories as well as simply most battles won. So some interesting parallels there. There's clearly a core of generals throughout history, from the ancient world all the way to the modern, that are seen as the greatest. Top of the pops, Napoleon Bonaparte, probably not a surprise. Such an enigmatic figure leading Republican revolutionary France to a number of notable victories to dominate Europe in the early 1800s, ultimately faced defeat, undone by his invasion of Russia, as we discussed in the Napoleon Total War video, and then ultimately defeated by Arthur Wellesley and coalition forces at the Battle of Waterloo. So Arthur Wellesley pops up in the top three in both lists. You've got Julius Caesar, of course, the great Roman commander, leads the legions to conquest in Gaul before the Civil War, and turning on Rome itself. Takeda Shingen makes an appearance in both lists. Alexander the Great makes an appearance in both lists. The names there that I've asterisked are names that are characters that I couldn't play as in the series. So they're generals that couldn't necessarily be represented through my gameplay. So Khalid ibn al-Walid appearing in both lists. They're not a name I was particularly familiar with coming into this, but a warrior of Islam's early expansion in the Middle East, as far as I understand it. So a general that was engaged in a great many battles, as far and clearly had a lauded career, but one that doesn't appear in a Total War game. It'd be very interesting if it did, but not a character we can engage with here. Alexander the Great, similar. I suppose I could have gone back to Rome 1 and play the Alexander campaign, but from my recollection, that campaign is a bit of a drudge, if I'm honest with you. I think I remember playing it and getting quite far and enjoying it, but it is quite a drudge, quite repetitive, and because you are just having to fight the Persians over again and churn out close victories as you go. It's kind of against the timer, which again I don't think fits very nicely with the whole Total War historical era defining sort of aesthetic. And then as I approached the end of the campaign, I was heading towards India, and I think my Alexander character caught a disease and died. So not a bad, historical narrative. Alexander the Great dies young on campaign. In fact, he dies younger in my campaign than he does in real life. But that did end up as just a game over, because Alexander needs to survive to the end. So yes, didn't really fancy going back and doing that. And then obviously the World War II generals. Unfortunately, no Total War coverage there for Montgomery or Zhukov. And Civil War also, there's good mods of Total War games, and very disappointing again that just Total War wasn't able to produce, whether it was an expansion to Empire Total War or a Civil War Total War. Again, it writes itself. It would be such a natural period of history for Total War to cover. But yeah, unfortunately, mods yes, but official games no. So we won't be seeing Ulysses S grant either, unfortunately. So starting off at the beginning, Roman Republic, Rome 2, historical generals appear throughout the game. There are a few for Carthage. Hannibal Barca is down there. I don't see many appearing for other factions in the game. With Rome, there are plenty that pop up as the game progresses, but in line with a lot of Rome 2's features, it's not done particularly well. Historical journals, they kind of pop out in the other nobles box in your family tree. And they're not great, they don't come out with tremendous stats, they don't stand out as notable generals, no more than any other character that might pop out, just generated within your family tree. But as I said, this is sort of a historical exploration, so I have wanted to play with historical generals. And therefore, these are the top generals that I managed to play as and their performances. What I've done across each game is compare them against each other in game. So the top three generals from each game will progress to the final, where we'll try and assess them on a more sort of normalized approach, so things don't differ too much. Because the way conflict evolves, the number of battles that might be involved, it differs greatly from game to game. How the battles play out, and so this for now is just looking at how the generals compare against each other within the Roman period based on these 5 criteria. So campaign being number of battles, destruction being number of kills, tactics being sort of kill ratio, so total kills divided by total losses, spoils being slaves, and the superiority being the average losses per battle. So that's kind of a flip. The lower the score for prior superiority, the higher the ranking. And these are the most notable generals that I came out with. So Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus coming out on top. Obviously, a celebrated Roman general leading campaigns against Carthage, comes out on top here, where I had him campaigning largely in Iberia, actually. He was largely in Spain. Gaius Julius Caesar, I had him campaigning in Gaul, somewhat historical. He did make it to Britain as well. And then Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who actually was assassinated while campaigning in Illyria. So he was well on his way to a far greater career, but had it cut short by an assassin's blade, campaigning for Rome in the East. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, just out of the top 3. Hannibal Barca also just out of the top 3. A very active, very celebrated year. With Hannibal, I burnt Rome. I surged through Rome and delivered great victories for Carthage. Greater, one might say, than the historical Hannibal Barca, as I did take and occupy Rome for a period. But overall, the numbers not quite good enough. And so just doesn't make the top 3. Demetrius, the second of Macedon, not a character that generated in the sort of other nobles box, but somebody within the family tree that is historically loyal. So I did put him as well. And then another Roman at the bottom there, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who also misses out on qualification. So an interesting top 3 there. Who are the top 3 Roman generals? You'd probably throw around Pompey the Great. You'd probably throw around, obviously, Julius Caesar. You'd probably throw around Scipio Africanus. So in a way, we've got a pretty historically loyal top 3 there. A top 3 that is somewhat representative of some of the most notable generals from the Roman period. And I've popped their pictures up at the top there. Publius Cornelius Scipio on the left, across to Sulla on the right. Going into the medieval period, so this is medieval 2, and medieval 2 doesn't really have historical generals, so this is a bit of a miss. At the start of the campaign, within your family tree, you will have historically, loyal characters. If you're England, for example, you will have King William, William the First, William the Conqueror, and then you do have a limited family tree below him, with, well, Rufus, who would be better known as William the Second, and then other, sons, Henry, etc. But they, depending on the faction, depending on the age, they die out fairly quickly. So very early on in the game, you're kind of out of historical characters, which is a shame. Yeah, which is a shame. It would be nice if there was some way in which Medieval 2 could have infused, could have created, historical characters. Again, perhaps a recruitable unit, but yeah, unfortunately, you do lose any historical characters pretty early on in the campaign. But my top performers for generals of the medieval period, I didn't want to leave them out, even though they are all fictitious. You've got John de Grey, Anglo-Norman knight, made constable of France at a very early age, defending the borders of Norman territories in northern France, and a very long and lauded career there, coming out on top for England. Second, Paolo Ugurieri, and I put the portraits from the game there at the top. Milanese general, a very effective field commander, and as you can see, spoils, a great looter, coming in second place there. And then finally Torgils of Denmark, a prince of Denmark, and leader of an invasion of Britain, amongst other campaigns. Then you've got Gerhard van Bolk of the Holy Roman Empire, and Yves de Nevers of France. So who just miss out on qualification for the greatest general of history title. Moving into the Sengoku period. Now here, much like Medieval 2, you have a family tree that starts out with historically loyal characters, but because we're playing a game that is far more concentrated over a shorter time period, a lot of those historical characters will persist more or less throughout the campaign. If you do end up with, many characters dying, then the new characters coming in will be fictitious, but it's quite easy to play a whole campaign using sort of only historically real characters, and these are the highest performers of those, if you like. So at the top, Oda Nobunaga, I think is fair. Figures on those lists that we started out looking at, and of course, especially within the context of the Sengoku Jidai, one of the great commanders, a brutal, a ruthless, and very effective tactician, who is recognized as the first great unifier of Japan for his bloody conquest of central Japan and occupation of Kyoto. Takeda Nobukada comes in second. So a notable general of the Takeda clan, but a brother with a far more recognizable Takeda Shingen. Now, in my campaigns, I tended to have the daimyo as sort of a roaming defensive army, sort of keeping the daimyo back from the front line, if you will. So I did have sort of lesser samurai, perhaps, lesser members of the family stand out, which is probably ahistorical. Daimyo did tend to lead from the front of Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, etc. But in this case, we've got one of Takeda Shingen's brothers, Takeda Nobukata, leading the way for the Takeda clan, and coming in at second place, are qualifying for the finals. And the same can be said of Shimazu Toshihisa, so a notable commander of the Shimazu clan, from what I've read poking around the internet, known as a resourceful commander, so someone probably more with a logistics bent. Not the most recognizable name, but in my campaigns at least, one of the leading lights, the leading military commanders of the age and of the Shimazu clan. Down the list there, we've got Uesugi Kenshin, the god of war, known for his uh, endless battles with Takeda Shingen. But in my campaign, he did struggle and was killed in battle. And I thought, well, you know what? Let's just go with it. It's a different outcome for the god of war. Um, but yes, sadly, he doesn't get anywhere near the top 10, the top three there. So going into the early modern period, so here we're with Empire Total War, which has, yet another different way of putting historical generals into the game. And here, a bit like Rome 2, there is a smattering of historical generals that occur throughout the campaign, but in this case, you do recruit a general cavalry unit, and it's kind of luck of the draw then as to what character you get, even if you get historically real character. Most factions have a number of historical generals that are available throughout the game. Britain has the most, I'd say, but France, Austria, Prussia, have plenty as well. Even the Maratha Confederacy has Bajirao the First, which I think is their one and only historical general. But they do pop up in line with their sort of real world lives, their real world careers. So they kind of pop up over the course of the campaign. And if you're aware of their sort of real world lives, you can kind of judge when they might pop up. Otherwise, you sort of get auto-generated generals with generic names. But as I say, nice to play with historical characters. But again, a bit like Rome 2, when they pop up, they aren't particularly special. They don't stand out. Which again is something that I think Total War could have made more of. But here we go. So we've got the Austrian general Leopold Joseph Graf von Daun at the top. And from what I've read, a very notable and well-respected commander of his time, but not a household name you'd say today, unless you're familiar with particularly Austrian history of the time, I suppose. But leading the way there in terms of campaign, in terms of battles, and in terms of destruction. Total kills, a very active, a busy campaigner, particularly in the south, particularly in Austria's wars with the Ottomans. Second, the French commander Maurice, Comte de Saxe, comes in a second. Again, historically in our world, a very notable, highly respected general of his time. Probably, is a name that would figure in the most notable generals of this period. So Maurice Comte de Saxe makes an appearance in the top three. And then another French general, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm. I deployed him largely in the Americas, which is also where he campaigned in real life, which is partly why his tactic score is so high there. There's a lot of battles against sort of Native Americans where, superior firepower did lead to some pretty lopsided outcomes. So he gets into the top three, leading the way in that tactic column. And then not making it through to the finals, we've got Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand of Prussia. We've got Suvorov, the great Suvorov of Russia, and then Charles Cornwallis, who will be known to any followers of American history and participating in the American Revolutionary War. In my campaigns, he campaigned largely in Europe, particularly in the Mediterranean, with wars with Spain. But yes, doesn't make it into the top three, doesn't make it through to the final. So, looking at Empire Total War, I thought I would bring through the admirals as well, because I do love the naval warfare element of Empire Total War. So I didn't want to leave out the admirals, because you can also access historical admirals in Empire Total War. Again, you have to recruit the admirals third rate, the admirals fifth rate, and it's luck of the draw as to whether you actually get a historical admiral or sort of an auto-generated admiral. Again, with Britain, there are many that appear in line with their historical careers, so you can generally get historical admirals throughout the campaign. With most other factions, there's far less. Again, just the nature of it, the folks behind Total War probably put a wee bit more effort into the English faction and picked out generals, although it will be no different. No, it will be much of a challenge to put a good few dozen generals and admirals into most factions, but it does seem to be the British and the Americans as well in their campaign that get a decent number of historical characters. But we have Sir John Jarvis, Lord St. Vincent, who comes out on top for the period, just above the Spanish Admiral Blas de Lezo y Olivarieta, and third, the Dutch commander, Jan Hendrik von Kingsbergen. And he's well worth researching because he had a fascinating career as sort of a jobbing admiral. Really, really fascinating career. So even the Dutch get access to some historical characters, which is great to see. That most factions are infused with these historical characters that as I say, sort of encourage interest, encourage investigation into their careers, and encourage sort of an immersion with the historical figures that shape the periods we're playing. Then we have Sir Hyde Parker, another British admiral, and then the Russian admiral Utakov, who rounds out the top 5, but don't make it in to the top 3. Moving in then to the Napoleonic Wars. Now, Napoleon Total War does historical generals again differently, and it's probably the best implementation of sort of historical generals in the whole series. In the wars, the campaigns of the coalition campaigns, so this is the Europe campaign, is what I'm basing it on. Each of the main factions has kind of an immortal general. So the Russians have Kutuzov, for example. The French obviously have Napoleon. The Prussians von Blucher. And these are generals that, if killed on the battlefield, are just injured. And it kind of goes with the sort of narrative, almost biographical nature of the gameplay, that you do have the key characters, some of the key characters at least, from a military sense, being able to persist throughout the game. Unless, of course, the faction is wiped out, in which case they're kind of taken off the map. But you do have these sort of immortal generals, and then you have a general's pool. So every time you want to add a general to an army, you can select a general from a list of 3, and that gets populated with historical generals through much of the campaign. So pretty much every faction of the 5 core factions has a pretty long list of generals. If you do go through generals particularly quickly, then you will end up with a lot of auto-generated names and attributes. But most factions, you'll be able to lead your armies with historical generals throughout the campaign, which I think is the best way of implementing it. I think if Total War were to have carried on into the 1800s and into the First World War, Second World period, I think that's one of the things that would have been carried on, historical generals being accessible throughout the campaign. But obviously, Total War went a different direction, drifted away from the modern period, where we do get historical generals, if you like, when you look at sort of Troy and obviously the Warhammer series, characters reoccurring across the game. But, they've obviously given quite strong attributes, game-defining attributes, whereas, with the implementation of historical characters, their attributes are fairly minor, but it just adds to that immersion, just adds to that connection with the historical world. So, unsurprisingly, Napoleon comes out on top, very active, 48 battles. The Russian general Kutuzov comes in second, and then the Prussian commander von Blucher in third. Arthur Wellesley misses out, so we won't have him figuring in the final conversation around the greatest generals. 22 battles, but a very high score there for destruction. So 22 big battles, not many skirmishes, large battles only for Arthur Wellesley, but not large enough to get him into the top 3. Louis Nicolas Davout, the Iron Marshal, one of Napoleon's most trusted marshals of France comes in there. Karl von Osterreich-Teschen of Austria, and then at the bottom, Michel Ney, another one of France's marshals, um, falling short of getting through to the final section. So, admirals, included admirals here as well, because naval gameplay is an important feature of Napoleon Total War, not anywhere near as important as Empire. You don't have those grand global trade networks to protect, etc. But certainly in terms of establishing naval superiority in Europe, blockading ports, reducing your opponent's ability to communicate and trade by sea, a key part of the campaign, and particularly obviously for the British who start up trying to establish control of the seas from the French in particular, not only to blockade and harass trade of for France and its allies, but also to protect the British Isles because France may well be planning an invasion. So up top, Horatio Nelson, Lord Nelson, of course, felled at Trafalgar in dramatic fashion, but in this timeline survives the Napoleonic period and comes out as the most lauded admiral of the age. Second, we got Dmitry Senyavin of Russia, and then finally Laurent Jean-François Truguet of France. Not many. Prussia doesn't really have a naval game to speak of in the campaign, nor does Austria really. So, in a way, these were just the sort of lead admirals of the three nations, if you will, in the Europe campaign that are going to have, a significant naval element to their overall performance. So, the greatest admiral. Not many options here. Again, sort of somewhat limited because of the lack of games really that have naval gameplay. I did think to include Shogun 2, but Shogun 2, the naval warfare in the Sengoku period, it is very important and it's not necessarily played up enough in game. It is a feature you need to be aware of. You want to protect your coastline from invasion. You would like to access the lucrative trade nodes. But really, it's still a campaign that is conducted on land. I just didn't find myself ever being drawn into very active naval warfare in Shogun 2. And that very much goes to game design. I think with Empire Total War, with Napoleon Total War, it is a legitimate part of your overall strategy as a player, and that's obviously very thematic for the time. In the Sengoku period, maybe less so, but also just the way the game is designed. Your victory is on land, so I just never found that I had notable admirals emerge during a Shogun 2 campaign. And the same is true of Rome too. There is naval warfare, but again, I just didn't feel it was implemented in a way that actually made it compelling. You just, yes, you want to protect your coastlines. Yes, you want to protect your ports, but it's still a game where you're going to conduct most of your campaigns on land. Once you've transported an army from A to B, that's sort of the naval element of the gameplay kind of done. So it is the age of sail, really, that we're talking about here. And Sir John Jervis. Sir John Jarvis comes out on top. Lord St. Vincent, certainly a celebrated admiral of his time, certainly a name that would probably float around in terms of the greatest admirals of the period. So a good result, I'd say. Again, because of the nature of the games, really, the top three come from Empire Total War, where you do have the opportunity to have far longer and more illustrious campaigns as naval commanders. But I'm quite happy with that result there, with Sir John Jarvis coming out on top. Obviously, Horatio Nelson would be a name you'd push up the list there. But yeah, with the limitations of the game, I mean, you can play as Nelson in Empire Total War, but again, because his career begins very much towards the end of the campaign, um, you aren't likely to do a great deal with him. Um, I did think to sort of combine those numbers, but then, yeah, we're talking about game by game. This is obviously not an exact or at all, uh, decisive process. But yeah, I was happy with that to see Lawson Vincent, Sir John Jarvis coming out as the greatest admiral of the Age of Sail. Um, and then the greatest generals. Well, having sent my uh, generals to the final rounds, it was, a difficult one, this to square, because obviously within each game, comparing generals against their peers, comparing generals against their contemporaries seems fairly straightforward, but then putting them against each other across times is very complicated. And I mean, that's the reality of doing this process, even if you were doing it on a very academic level. How do you compare Oda Nobunaga to Napoleon Bonaparte? I mean, they are chalk and cheese. They're separated by a few hundred years in terms of their careers, the technology, the cultural background, a lot different. Um, but in a way, doing it through a game kind of allows you to do away with that, the historical contextualization, because you can kind of maybe rely on a bit of data. But how Total War presents warfare across different games again is very different. Oda Nobunaga, clearly these two characters rise to the top. Campaign just simply number of battles. Shogun 2, Napoleon Total War, two games that really focus in on constant conflict. And so it's unsurprising that they rise to the top, at least if you're going to base one of your criteria on number of battles. I didn't like doing it, but I felt it should be there. And again, I wasn't doing it on raw numbers. It was just sort of, if you're at the top, you get the top mark. You get 5 out of 5. So I thought it felt kind of fair. And it's not a bad outcome, is it? Because going back to those lists at the outset, Oda Nobunaga, did figure. And I think historically you would say, one of the greatest generals, certainly in terms of, that potted history, that, within the context of the Sengoku period, undoubtedly one of the greatest commanders come out of that period. Um, and similarly, Napoleon Bonaparte, one of the greatest commanders of all time, and one of the greatest, clearly the greatest commanders of the early 1800s. And so I think, not a bad outcome. Louis Joseph de Montcalm, no, he wouldn't go away. I thought, well, why not give him his due? In terms of tactics, he outperformed a great many other generals with that 7.58 kill ratio. Toshihisa and Lucius Cornelius Sulla round out the top 5, because I thought, well, I took away some of the criteria that felt too specific to the game. Obviously, slaves, for example, don't appear in generals numbers for Shogun 2 or Empire Total War, for example. So I did it based on these 3 criteria: number of battles, total destruction, and tactics. Because again, doing it purely on tactics didn't feel quite right. So to putting in something else, so I thought was necessary. And ultimately, not a bad outcome. Oda Nobunaga, top of the pops, the greatest general of all time, the first great unifier of Japan, in my campaigns at least, a tireless and brutal commander. Napoleon Bonaparte in second. Again, one of the most celebrated generals of all history, conqueror of Europe until he foolishly, perhaps, invaded Russia. And the old Louis Joseph de Montcalm, one of the most, certainly for my playthroughs, given his tactical nous, one of the most celebrated tacticians of the 1700s. So there we go, folks. Greatest general of all time, Oda Nobunaga. And yeah, that wraps it up then, folks. So thanks for tuning into this little aside video, an interesting exploration of historical generals, how they're portrayed in Total War, and who comes out on top. Um, Not a bad result, I'd say, and yeah, another victory for the Oder clan.